Hey everyone. Hey. Hopefully you were able to do your test or do your exam well and you were happy with your exam grade whenever you see it online. Now keep in mind, if it's the score that you want, good job, and I'm proud of you for studying hard and studying well. If it's not quite the score that you want, or it's not the score that you hope for, now remember, this exam is the only of the first of the 4 exams that you take. You take another cumulative exam later on at Christmas. So even if you didn't know it in this last quarter, you still want to try to figure out, okay, what did I miss, or how should I study, or how should I prepare so that way I don't miss the same material again, or how can I do better on the next exam. So whenever we go over the exams eventually, so make sure that you're ready to come with questions and that you're ready to go, okay, what can I do to focus better on? But like I said, for those of you that are happy with your exam score, good job, and I'm proud of you. But just make sure though that you are still studying. This next section, the next test, is just over this particular section. So don't just think about how well you did on the past exam. You want to think of, okay, for this next upcoming test, what do I need to focus on, what do I need to study on so I can do just as well on this upcoming test. Alright, so let's go ahead and let's get into it. I'm going to give you some classwork, since I didn't give you any official homework on Friday because of the exam. I'm going to give you some classwork so you can kind of start thinking about our new material, so that way it'll help you guys as I start teaching it. So I want you to read pages 133 to page 135, 133 to page 135, and answer on page 135 questions 1 through 6. It should only take you probably about 5 to 10 minutes, maybe 10, 12, 13 minutes, depending on how fast you read, but it shouldn't take you a very long time, so don't spend too long on it. So only spend about 5 to 10 minutes, maybe upwards of 15, but that's it. You don't want to spend too long on it. So go ahead and pause the video, and then come back whenever you're done with that. Alright, assuming that you're watching this now, that means that you've gone ahead and answered the questions. So going over questions 1 through 6 on page 135, what tariff placed a higher duty on imported goods to protect American manufacturers from foreign competition? That is the tariff of 1816, and you'll want to note the date for that. Number 2, what Republican presidential candidate won the election of 1816? That's James Monroe. Number 3, what was the name given to Monroe's administration by a Boston paper? That is the error of good feelings. We'll talk about the reasons why. Number 4, what term means buying something with the intention of selling it at a profit when the market price rises? That is called speculation. Number 5, in which case the Supreme Court ruled that the state did not have the right to interfere with the charter of a private college? That is Dartmouth College versus Woodward. So make a note for that. And then number 6, name the case when the Supreme Court defined interstate commerce. That is Gibbons versus Ogden. And we'll talk about those court cases later on. Alright, so you can go ahead and take out your textbook. You can fill your classwork for right now, or if you want to have a notebook paper so that way you can take notes, whatever works for you as we're going through this distance learning. Alright, so chapter 10, the nationalist era. So remember, the War of 1812 is over. Now remember, the War of 1812 lasted from when to when? 1812 to 1814, technically, with the Treaty of Ghent. Now remember, what battle happened after the treaty was signed, though? Of Andrew Jackson. So the Battle of New Orleans, that happened in 1815. So once we had the War of 1812, even though technically it lasted from 1812 to 1814, we had this new spirit of nationalism. People were proud of the United States. Now remember, whenever we had our War for Independence, there was a lot of uncertainty with that critical period. Not really sure, okay, how are we going to run our new country? What are we going to do for our new country? Are we going to be more of a confederacy? Are we going to be more united? How are we going to work? Is there going to be a federal system? Are we going to be a democratic system or a republic system? Specifically, what are we going to do? So there was a lot of uncertainty. By the War of 1812, once that was over, we were taking pride, realizing, yes, we are a nation. We can hold our own against another nation like Great Britain. So previously, we were fighting for our independence. The War of 1812 had helped demonstrate to the world of, yes, the United States of America is a nation that is on par with other nations of Europe. Now, we weren't seeking conflict, but it was one of those, okay, we can defend ourselves. We're just as good as country as the older countries of Europe. Alright, so your book points out that the spirit of nationalism was demonstrated by the disappearance of party strife. We were having less in this time period, more of one party versus another. Now, unfortunately, this comes back, but during this era, we just start off with two parties, but in this time period, one party basically fades away. So remember, what are the two parties during this era? Right, the Democratic Republicans, and then you have the Federalist Party. You're going to start to see the fading away of the Federalist Party at this point. So there is only one party, but just because we have one party doesn't mean all the country is unified. You're going to notice as well that it's going to be in several cases where it's the north of the country versus the south of the country versus the west of the country. So you're going to see three different sections of the country start to develop. Typically, we associate north versus south. But we also see that the west, or the frontier section, is also a section of the country that kind of rivals north and south. So your book's pointing out though as well, even though we do have that rising of sectionalism, of having different sections of the country versing each other, overall, most sections agreed, no, for the good of the country, here's what needs to happen. So we do see different sections of the country kind of versing each other, not necessarily parties, but overall, most people realize, for the good of the country, even though I may not personally like it, we're going to go ahead and go through with it. So we call this whole era the Nationalist Era. Make a note of the dates for the Nationalist Era. So make a note for these dates as we're going through it. So it's 1814 through 1828. I think, check my screen, I just wanted to make sure it still works. Yep, it does. I'm going to slide this down so that I don't forget. Alright, so 1814 to 1828. Make a note for those dates for the Nationalist Era. It's a little high. Let me move that down. That gave you whiplash a little bit. Alright, so 1814 to 1828. Look at the quote by Albert Gallatin at the top of the page. You should recognize his name as a side note. We've already talked about him. The War of 1812 has renewed and reinstated the national feelings and character which the Revolution have given, and which were daily lessened. He's just saying, hey, we used to be very proud of our nation at the end of the War for Independence because we were a new nation. But the novelty or the newness of it has kind of gone down. We're not really that excited about it anymore. With the War of 1812, it rekindled that spirit of, yes, we are a nation. So it makes us proud of our country all over again. Alright, so America after the War of 1812. Now remember, the first national bank, it was allowed to expire in 1811. So make a note for that. The Republican Congress will the charter of the first national bank to expire in 1811. Now, you can't just not have banks. So since the national bank was not around or its charter had expired, a lot of states said, okay, we're going to have individual state banks. If there's no federal bank or there's no national bank, we're going to do it where it's like the State Bank of Georgia, or the Alabama State Bank, or the Florida State Bank, even though Florida is technically not really a state at this point. So, these state banks, they're saying, okay, we're going to have each individual state is in charge, and there's these state banks that regulate it per state. So, these banks, though, they were being unwise in their practices. They began to issue excessive amounts of paper money. Now, remember, back in this time period, you were supposed to be able to take that paper money, bring it to a bank and say, hey, I want to turn in this paper money for the same amount of gold and silver. So the bank was supposed to have enough gold and silver on hand to be able to pay off the paper money if they had to. Well, willing to take high chances for it, these banks weren't doing that. They're saying we're just going to print or basically make a lot of paper money, and we don't have the gold or silver to back it up. We're just going to just keep making it for it. So they issued more banknotes than they could back up with gold or silver. Your book introduces another term called specie. Make a note of that. That's what we call it for the gold or silver. And so just make a note of that. They were issuing more banknotes than they could back up with gold or silver. So we call that specie. We're going to talk more about that later on. So just make a note for it. Not species. Just be careful. Specie. Alright, the paper money, it fell in value though until it was basically worthless. Basically, they created inflation to where they printed a whole bunch of paper money, but each individual paper money wasn't worth a whole lot. Whenever it started affecting the federal government though, whenever the federal government said, we need to do something about this, this isn't going to work. You can't have banks just print money in the states. That's not going to work. So, because of that, the Republican Party issued a 20-year charter for the second bank of the United States. They said, okay, we're going to reinstitute the bank again. It's going to last for 20 years. But this is the second bank of the United States. So, it passed in 1816. This is a date you need to know. So, 1816, we had the second charter of the National Bank. Technically, we just call it the second bank of the United States, that it was started in 1816. Henry Clay. Now remember, Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun, you should note them previously. What were their nicknames? Because they wanted to go to war against Great Britain. The War Hawks. Perfect. So because of that, these two gentlemen, they typically have different opinions, kind of how like we had Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson were rivals. They did not like each other, and they had different views over how the government should run. You're going to see this in this section too. Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun did not agree on how the government should be run, so you're going to see them butting heads a lot in this section. So Henry Clay, he had originally said, I do not like the National Bank. I want strict construction of the Constitution. I don't like the National Bank. He said at this point, okay, I don't like it, but for the good of the nation, I understand we need the National Bank. So look at his quote. He was willing to sacrifice the pride of consistency rather than jeopardize the interest of the nation. What he's saying is, okay, I know I said previously I didn't like it, but I will sacrifice my pride of consistency. I know what I said previously, but I'm changing my mind. I'll sacrifice my pride of consistency for it because for the good of the nation, we need the National Bank. So that's what he's saying at this point. Just make a note of him that he was the Republican leader at this time period. And so originally he said I didn't like it. This is one reason why a lot of the Republicans swapped over, is because they said, even though we personally don't like this, we understand and we agree that okay, we need the National Bank. So, make a note for that, make a note of the year, 1816, and make a note that this is whenever the Second National Bank was started or chartered. Alright, growth of American manufacturing. So, since we didn't have a lot of trade right before the War of 1812, and then during the War of 1812, we didn't have a lot of trade hardly at all. Because remember, we had the Embargo Act and the Non-Intercourse Act. What was the Embargo Act? That's whenever Thomas Jefferson and his cabinet, he convinced Congress saying, okay, we're not going to trade with England or France. And then the Non-Intercourse Act, the Non-Intercourse also prohibited trade as well. And so because of that, we couldn't trade with other nations. So how are we going to get our manufactured goods if we can't trade with other nations? Alright, we have to make it ourselves. So that's how manufacturing started really taking off in America. Because if you wanted a product that was made in a factory, or made by some industry. Factories come a little bit later, is how we think of them. But if you want an industry where they're making a product, you want to buy it from them, you're going to have to make it yourself or find someone in your area that makes it. So America, they begin to produce or make their own goods. So like wool, your book puts out woolen and leather products, large amounts of iron, textiles, paper, hats, gunpowder, glass. And so we're starting to make our own products for it. Republicans had traditionally favored more of an agricultural economy. Thomas Jefferson and his followers said that the way of the nation should be more agricultural based. They felt like that was a better source of income. Thomas Jefferson realized as well by this point that, okay, well, agriculture is good. The money is in industry. And he was realizing, okay, if we're going to survive as a nation, we need to be able to make our own products. We should be independent of other nations. So if we go to war against another nation, we aren't stuck stranded. So he understood now, okay, well, agriculture is good. We do need industry as well. That's how come your book has this quote as well. He originally said, let our workshops remain in Europe. But then he realized, and he said later on, experience has taught me that manufacturers are now as necessary to our independence as our comfort. Because he was saying, okay, if we want to be independent of other nations, then we have to make our own products. We can't have something like this happen again where we went to war against Great Britain and then all of our goods were cut off. We shouldn't do that. We need to be able to make our own products. We see this again later on in history with oil prices. Now remember, where do we get most of our oil from in the United States? Or if you're any nation, basically, where do you get most of your oil from? Yep, the Middle East. You're going to see this in more recent history as we get closer to our time period, that the Middle East started jacking up the prices of oil, basically seeing how high they can get it to see how much will the rest of the world pay for our oil. At that time period in America, we didn't drill for a lot of our own oil. We just kept buying it out of the Middle East. So whenever the Middle East started jacking up the prices, we realized, oh, we're in trouble. We need oil for cars and other things. So if we can't pay the Middle East, then we're going to be in trouble. We need to start looking for our own oil. And that's one of the reasons why Americans started looking and drilling for our own oil in the United States. That's the reason why we have a lot of oil we know now in Alaska and Texas. Now, we don't really, and in other sections as well, but those two areas are the two primary ones. So we know where our oil is if we ever have to use it. Now, the Middle East, keep their prices low enough to where it's cheaper just to buy it from the Middle East than to start drilling it and get it out of our own soil. But at least we know to where, okay, if the Middle East starts doing that again, we can at least go and get our own oil if we need to. So that's part of the reason why it's important to know, okay, that you have a backup plan if you're going to buy something from another nation, that you have a backup plan in case the other nation starts to take advantage, or if you go to war against that nation. You have a different way to get your resource from it. So again, this is another example. We'll talk more about that as we get closer to our period of history. Alright, so the tariff of 1816. Alright, because the tariffs are given dates, you need to note this date with the tariff. So, the full date for it is the tariff of 1816. So don't just memorize 1816 for the National Bank. You want to note the tariff of 1816 as well for it. So, that's the full name for that tariff. So, it's the tariff of 1816. This is the first time we really see a protective tariff. So, once the War of 1812 was over, a lot of the goods in Europe, some of the manufacturers have been stockpiling their goods, waiting to ship them over to America so that they could make a lot of money. Well, since they had been stockpiling them, they could sell them at a much lower price than our American manufacturers. And our manufacturers said, well, that's not fair. England is flooding the market with these really cheap products. We're going to go out of business. National government, help us. And so this is whenever the national government said, okay, we need to help and protect our manufacturers. We don't want to just keep buying from England over and over and over again. That's not healthy. So even though England's prices are cheaper right now, we don't want to just basically put all of our American manufacturers out of business. We want to make sure we have some of our American manufacturers survive and that they can still carry on business. Now remember, a tariff is basically a tax on an imported good. So they were taxed on purpose to protect the American manufacturers. That's what they're known as a protective tariff. Make a note of that. This was the first time we really see this specific type of tariff. So just make a note of the tariff of 1816. This is the first time we really see a protective tariff because it was put a tax on these goods on purpose to raise their prices so that way it would be more on equal footing with our manufacturers to help protect our manufacturers. The tariff received opposition from the northern shippers because they said, hey, we're trading with Great Britain. If you raise the prices, England won't ship over as many goods. We're going to lose money. The South also didn't like it because the Southern planters said, we're just paying extra taxes to help out the North. We don't really like this either. But both groups realized, okay, overall, for the good of the nation, because manufacturing is good for our country, and we don't want all of our manufacturers to go out of business, we will go ahead and accept this protective tariff. Even though we might not like it a whole lot, we will go ahead and accept it. Now, you make a note of John C. Calhoun, that he does not like protective tariffs. You're going to see him over and over again as more and more protective tariffs get passed, that he does not like them. But he said, okay, for right now, these are a good thing. Look at his quote at the top of page 134 on the right side, that he said is the duty of this country as a means of defense to encourage domestic industry. He said, okay, the War of 1812 was not a good idea for us having all of our trade cut off of Great Britain, and we were so used to buying our goods from Great Britain that we were hurt by this. So no, we need to make sure we have some of our manufacturers survive, so that way we don't ever become that dependent on another country again. So he said, okay, even though this tariff is specifically helping out the North and the northern manufacturers, overall it's for the good of the country, so overall we'll let this go. So again, this is one reason why this whole era is known as the nationalist era, because it was for the good of the whole nation, not just one party versus each other or one section of the country versus each other. You see this a lot throughout this time period. Alright, so the era of good feelings. So this particular expression is associated with James Monroe. I forgot to change my batteries. So with James Monroe for it. So in 1816, the Republican presidential candidate was James Monroe. Make a note of him. He won and beat Rufus King. This is the last time we see the Federalist Party attempt to run a party member on the presidential candidate. The Federalist Party basically disappears after this. So the Republicans had adapted so many policies that most people have flipped over to being a Republican or a Democratic Republican technically, instead of being a Federalist. So that party kind of shrinks away and becomes nothingness and this era. Now, we have other parties form up, but during this era, you see the Federalist Party fade away. So it's basically just one party in America during this time period. So, taking out though of James Monroe. We already talked about James Monroe. What did we talk about him previously? What did he help out with? What purchase? Right, the Louisiana Purchase. What year was that? I know the exam's over, but you should still know this. 1803. Good job. How much did we pay for it? Approximately 15 million. Good job. Alright, so just make sure though, you are still connecting all of these ideas. Don't just think people exist in one chapter and that's it. Nope. These people, they are living and they typically exist in your book and then of course in real life. They exist longer than one chapter. Now, of course, all these people are dead by this point, by our time. But in this time period, you're going to see several people like Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun. They're in several chapters because they existed in politics for a lot longer than just one particular era. And so they did a lot of great things. So just make sure that you relate to, I've already talked about this person. They're still alive, at least at this point in history. And so because of that, they're still involved in politics. So be sure to connect all of your ideas and don't just think of it as just chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3 sections, like how your book has it divided. So see the flow of history as we go through it. Alright, so James Monroe, make a note for him that a lot of people really like James Monroe. Your book points out that one of the Boston newspapers characterized his election as the beginning of an era of just good feelings. Since most people were part of the Democratic Republic Party, or the Republican Party, that they said, okay, most people have this idea of, okay, here's how we think the government should be run. We all want the United States to exist and to do well as a country, even though it might be a northerner or a southerner or a westerner, might not agree on everything. Overall, it's for the goodness of the nation. There's an air of good feelings. Everyone basically gets along. Now again, not everyone agrees with every single thing, every single person, but this is the idea that everyone understood that, okay, we all understand like the same basic ideas, we all want the same basic ideas, and we all want the same basic things, so we can get along. So this is the era of good feelings. Your book points out that he won the first election and he won a second election as well as in 1820. Now, your book points out that he had all of the electoral votes except one. You're going to see this a couple times in history, where you have one of the electors basically throws the vote for the other candidate because they don't want a presidential candidate to get all of the electoral votes. Why do you think the reason was typically to why you have an elector basically throw his vote to where it wouldn't all go to one candidate? Think of it previously. What was the only candidate that has won by a complete unanimous vote of the Electoral College? George Washington. And so because of that, we see this several times in history that one of the electors will always go, I don't want him, I don't want this presidential candidate to get all the electoral votes either, because George Washington had all of the electoral votes and he should be the only president to have a unanimous vote. I'm going to throw mine to the other candidate just because, to make sure that George Washington is the only one that still has it. We have this a couple times in history where typically they throw it on purpose just because of that. They want George Washington to be the only presidential candidate to win by a complete unanimous vote, so they will on purpose throw it. Again, not all the time, but that's one of the reasons why you see this kind of happen a lot, is because they just throw it just to make sure George Washington stays the only one that has a complete unanimous vote. And again, just out of respect for George Washington, doesn't actually do anything, just one of those, out of respect for George Washington, he should be the only one, and so we're going to continue to do it this way. Alright, so just make a note that his era, or his presidency, marks the beginning of the era of good feelings. Make a note for that. Alright, the Panic of 1918. So, in 1890, this is another date that you need to know. This is day one of your new material, and you're already having a bunch of dates, so make sure you're keeping up with it. So, 1819, this is whenever we had an economic depression. Now, this is not the Great Depression. We think of the Great Depression of the 1920s. This is clearly not the 1920s. That's 100 years later. So, right now, we're in this depression. This is because of all the banks out west printing excessive paper money. But this was causing issues. So, make a note, in 1811, you had an economic crisis through the country into a depression where you have the value of the money start to dip because of it. So because of this, you had a lot of people move out west after the Treaty of Ghent. And so because of that, what they started doing was what was known as speculation. They would buy up the land and then they would wait for for the land value to increase, and then they would try to sell it off to make some extra money. You can do that, and that's fine. That's part of the reason of taking risk. Obviously, the idea of, okay, I'm going to buy this product, and I'm going to hopefully increase the value, and then I'll sell it later on. You can do this on Amazon and eBay as a side note. That's one reason why people, they will buy up collector toys, and then wait 10, 20, 30 years, and then sell them at a much higher price. If you look to see how much some of your parents' toys are worth on Amazon or eBay today, you will be shocked at how much. If you can find those original products, they're worth a lot today. Some of them, not all of them. But that's an idea of just buying something and then holding out until the market price increases. In this era, though, they were doing it in a more reckless fashion. What they were doing was they were borrowing money for the bank. Now, money that they did not have, so it is on loan to them. They have to pay the bank back. They would take that money, buy land, and then hope that the land value would go up enough to pay off the bank and then have extra money. That's two dangerous acts at the same time. So not only are you buying land with the hope of, okay, it should hopefully go up, and I hope it does. It might not. You don't know. It might not go up. But they're hoping, okay, it'll go up in value. But I'm not going to risk my money. I'm going to take money from the bank on a loan, invest that in the land, and then hopefully the land goes up in enough value so that way I can pay off the bank, give the bank back its money, and then I will make some money as well. That's more risky. Now, your book points out that some banks out west, they were known as wildcat banks because they were doing these unshaky business practices, and they were more of doing some more dangerous practices to where it wasn't good long term for the banks to keep doing this type of thing, but they were still encouraging it. So they freely and recklessly loaned money, anticipating big profits. If you want to go get a loan from the bank today, the bank will not just give you money just because you asked for it. Typically, they will check your credit scores and other things to make sure that the bank will get their money back. The bank will not just give you money just because you went up and you asked nicely. That's not how it works today. So these banks, though, they were just, you want some money? Sure, pay us back. You want some money? Sure, pay us back. Now, again, the bank can't do that over and over and over again because the bank only has so much gold and silver on the inside. So these wildcat banks were being extremely reckless in how they were giving out money to many people. They're giving large amounts to people that may or may not could pay it back, and then those people were taking the money and then using it in speculation. So again, lots of dangerous, risky things happening. The National Bank at first said, oh, okay, that's fine, you can do that. But the National Bank was starting to realize by 1818, oh, no, we take it back. You are loaning out way too much money to way too many people, and they are investing it in some risky speculation. Take it back. You can't loan out money anymore. Well, since the banks could no longer loan out money, then you couldn't have people take out money to go buy the land from the people that were trying to sell it at the higher value. So now you have people that are stuck with land that they didn't actually buy because they borrowed money from the bank. And now since the bank is asking them for their money back, the people can't give it back yet. They only have land. They don't have the money to actually pay back the bank. And so because of that, a lot of the banks were in trouble and a lot of the people were in trouble because there wasn't actually money that they could use to pay off their debts. And so because of that, both institutions, wildcat banks and the people, they were left unable to pay out their financial obligations, and a panic broke out. So you had a minor dip in the economy. So that's one reason why it was considered a depression, the Depression of 1819 in particular. Now, this depression lasted from 1819 to 1821, so only about 2 years. Now, we think, oh, 2 years, that's not that bad. Yeah, but it was risky for back then. This is kind of the first major depression we see for our country. That's the reason why we still, excuse me, I have a hiccup. That's the reason why we still talk about it. Now again, Great Depression, a lot worse. But for this one, it was only about 2 years, but it was still shaky and it made a lot of people nervous and unstable. Alright, really quick with John Marshall and the Supreme Court. You already talked about John Marshall, we already talked about him. What court case did he originally do? Now remember, it was Mulberry versus Madison with the idea of judicial review or declaring something unconstitutional. He did 3 other court cases in particular that you need to know for it. So, just make a note though for these 3 court cases as we go through them, what happened with them. Alright, so one of the main areas with the panic of 1819, Some people were critical of the national bank. So the state of Maryland tried to discourage the national bank by saying we're going to tax the national bank in the state of Maryland, in particular the Baltimore branch. Now we look back on that and we think that's kind of weird. You're going to have a state tax part of the federal government. Yeah, and it is weird. This is the first case where we have actually tried to say, okay, can you have a state tax a portion of the federal government? Can you do that? The Supreme Court said, no, you can't do that. Because it's the federal government, you can't tax the federal government. So, making up for this, so, McCulloch versus Maryland, because that's what it basically boils down to. The John Marshall, he said, nope, it's implied powers. It's implied in the Constitution that we are to regulate and maintain currency. We need a national bank to do this. So no, you cannot tax a branch of the federal government or a portion of the federal government. So make a note of this. The Marshall, he upheld the doctrine of implied powers, saying, okay, so the loose interpretation of the Constitution. Now remember, what's loose interpretation mean? Right, it means that, okay, it doesn't actually say it, but it's implied by the wording of the Constitution, even though it doesn't say it specifically written word for word in the Constitution. So you're saying, okay, yes, this is a loose interpretation of the Constitution. We're going to uphold this decision that supporting a national bank was necessary and proper for the country and for the economy. So the Supreme Court ruled, okay, yes, this is implied power. It's implied by the Constitution, so yes, you can have it. No, you cannot tax it. So that's what happened with McCulloch versus Maryland. Just make it up for him. The second major one was Dartmouth College versus Woodward. What happened was that the state of New Hampshire was trying to say, okay, Dartmouth College is a private college. We're going to make it a public college. We're trying to basically kidnap it and make it into a public institution. That would be like the state of Georgia deciding that Grace Christian School was no longer Grace Christian School. It is now Grace Public School, and basically deciding, could you have your state just decide, can you be a public school or a public institution, or can we hijack it and make you a public institution? Can we take over your school? The Supreme Court said, no, you can't do that either. To where, no, it's a private institution, it's privately funded, they want to be a private institution. You cannot go in and hijack them and take them and make them become a public institution if they don't want to be a public institution. And we at Grace Christian School and all the private schools are very excited, and we are very proud of this decision, because if you're a private institution or if you go to a private school, then there's a reason why your parents want you in a private institution. It's typically because there's something about the public schools in the area that your parents don't like. So they are putting you in a private school on purpose. And the Supreme Court said, if you are a private institution, a private school, you cannot be forced to be a public school. You can stay a private school. So again, we look at that and we go, that's kind of weird. But it was a lot of these early ideas of what can the state governments do? And the Supreme Court said, no, you can't do that. You can't take over and hijack a private institution. And we are very proud of this. At least at Grace Christian School, we are very proud because we do not want to get taken over by the state governments or by the federal government. So just thinking after this. So Dartmouth College versus Woodward basically saying, can the states hijack and take over a private institution? No, you can't do that. Alright. Gibbons versus Ogden. This one boiled down to basically the state of New York had granted a monopoly on a certain group of businessmen to ferry people back and forth across the rivers. It's a little bit more complicated than that, but that's the basic ideas for it. So John Marshall said, no, you can't have the state basically give that privilege away to certain businessmen. Interstate commerce or trading going back and forth across the lines of a state is reserved for the federal government to regulate, not the states. So no, you can't give that away to certain businesses or certain people. So it said, no, we are to regulate it. That'd be why I like the idea of basically saying, what can you bring across the border from one state to another? Like if you're going from Alabama to Georgia, what are you allowed to bring as interstate commerce for like trading or selling? What can you bring back and forth across the line? The state of New York at this time period was saying, okay, only certain people can transport some things. And the government said, no, you can't give that away. It's for us to regulate, and we're going to regulate it differently. You can't just give it just to certain people. Alright, so just being out, so Gibbons versus Ogden, whatever they said is the federal government's job to regulate interstate commerce, and we would agree with that's a good thing. And it's also with the idea of the other two court cases, make a note of them as well. So McCulloch versus Maryland, that it enforced the doctrine of implied powers. Dartmouth College versus Woodward, the state cannot take over a private institution, and then Gibbons versus Ogden, that interstate commerce is for the federal government to regulate, not for states to regulate. Alright, so just make note of John Marshall. He did a lot of important court cases with the Supreme Court. He was a Supreme Court justice for about 34 years, your book points out, and he took every opportunity to try to expand the Supreme Court's power. Now, today we would say they probably have a little bit too much power, but again, this is early on in this time period. He made a lot of good Supreme Court decisions. Alright, we'll go ahead and we'll stop there. Your homework for tonight. Read pages 136 through 140, 136, 140. Answer on page 137, questions 1 through 4, and on page 140, questions 1 through 5. You'll be fine. So read pages 136 to 140, answer page 137, questions 1 through 4, and on page 140, questions 1 through 5. Now you want to start learning the presidents in order for last name. You only need to know the first names of the presidents for the ones that are duplicates, like John Quincy Adams and then John Adams. So make a note for them. Your textbook has a list. You want to look on the back pages for you. On page number 100, what page is this? 138. So just make a note for them. So you want to learn the first 25. So the first 25. So you have John Adams, and then you have John Quincy Adams. Those are the only two, I believe, for this first section where there's duplicates. I don't think there's any others. I'll double check, but I believe that's the only time that there's a duplicate one for them. So make a note, first 25, you want to learn this. There are several songs on YouTube. You can memorize it too. I would play mine, but it doesn't go well with the video recording. My video that I like to use is to the tune of Yankee Doodle. So if you want the YouTube link, I can email it to your parents. So have your parents email me and ask me if you want to know what video am I using, so that way it's easier whenever we come back for you to be able to figure out, okay, which one are we going through it? Because you're gonna have to write out the president's last name in order next Wednesday. So hopefully, you should be back in school by then. So you want to start working on them now. So again, you can find YouTube videos where it's the president's last names to songs. So find a good one that works for you. There's several of them out there. The one that I like is one to Yankee Doodle. So again, if you want the YouTube video, you can ask your parents to email me, and then I'll email the link specifically to them for it. So just make a note for that and start working on it as well. All right, have a good day.